Hello and welcome back. So we'll be talking about the British Empire today. As you can see, if you can see on this map, very spread out, somewhat disjointed, um, sort of colonial power, right? As we'll see, a lot of it early on, or at least a lot of stages, wasn't even necessarily um, land or territory that was owned by the British, but more by just various companies, British companies. So if you were to look at England in the 1500s, it wouldn't look anything like an empire. Not even the entire island of Britain was unified. So in the 1700s, England united with Scotland and then with Wales uh, to at least unify that island, and this was sort of the beginnings of further expansion. Um, and at the time, as the Spanish and the Portuguese and other powers had been acquiring colonies for centuries now, uh, England was not particularly interested in the Americas. They were happy to just trade through the Italian merchants, Venetians, and such. But there came a point where you really couldn't get away from it, right? You had to sort of enter into the colonial game. Other empires were expanding their own dominance of various trade routes and trying to sort of like maximize their own profits at the expense of the other players. Uh, may recall the Spanish Armada, right, of 1588, where Spain attempted to take over England. Uh, Spain lost that battle, right, but it was a important lesson for the British, right? The point was made crystal clear. Um, there was all sorts of internal Protestant Catholic conflict going on in England. France was becoming an important power, and they're right on the other side of the English Channel there. So it was clear that England not just sort of hang out on the sidelines. England needed to get into the game and start expanding and become imperial power in its own right. So the Spanish Armada, right, end of the 1500s. Unification doesn't happen until the 1700s. Uh, but the eventual unification of Britain came about because there was sort of a peasant rebellion in Scotland, right? And so the upper classes in Scotland that were being threatened by their peasants needed some help. So they looked to the English, and unification sort of helped the upper classes defend their interests against the lower classes. Similar thing going on in Wales, right, which is on sort of the west coast of the British Isles. And so that unification process was largely of, aristocrats who were banding together to protect their interests. The colonization of Ireland was a different sort of process. So Ireland is a separate island off the coast of England. If you've ever been, it's a sort of a ferry ride from England to Ireland. So Ireland was Catholic, Britain was Protestant at this time, um, and so the process of taking over Ireland was more or less the way the Spanish took over the Americas, which was send um, set up plantations, right? Send colonists over, sort of rich British lords that wanted to try to, or people that wanted to try to make it rich in Ireland, would basically take land from the native Irish and establish some sort of plantation and bring in English colonists to work the land. So basically just stealing land. Um, so there were large waves of immigration from Britain to Ireland, some 100,000 people by 1641. And the distinction here, right, the class system was reinforced by a difference in religion. So the Catholic Irish were treated as a lower class, sort of viewed with suspicion, right, as maybe potential allies of their uh, Catholic enemies like France and Spain, right? So the Irish were not allowed to join the military. They weren't really allowed any positions of political power, and they were sort of a permanent underclass. So in Ireland, they did sort of straightforward old-fashioned colonization, not unlike the Spanish. But elsewhere in the world, they sort of pioneered a new method of colonial expansion, which was through chartered companies. So these are, like the corporations we have today, and but this is sort of birth of that sort of entity on the world scene as a major player. So one important such company was the British East India Company. So they acquired territory in India. Um, the land was technically not owned by the British; it belonged to the company. Right? They sort of followed in the footsteps of an earlier company called the Levant Company, which was in sort of Israel, modern Israel, Palestine. Um, that company was dealing with the Ottoman Empire, trying to set up, deals for the British to trade in the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The East India Company um, was concerned with India, which was ruled by the Mughals. So the Mughals were, right, the name is similar to Mongol, and that's not an accident. They were descended from Tamerlane's Mongol Empire, um, and so they were Islamic, and they had sort of conquered and ruled over a primarily Hindu population in India. So the Mughals were the upper class, and sort of the indigenous Hindus were the ruled by them. So, not unlike the Ottomans, the Mughals were primarily interested in trade, right? They weren't particularly interested in converting all of their Hindu subjects to Islam or anything like that. As long as the trade flowed and the taxes were paid, they were happy. So, the East India Company, EIC, I'm just abbreviating it. Uh, they made up a deal with the Mughals that worked out well for everyone. So they provided the Mughals access to European markets, and for a while it was just, it was largely a friendly and profitable arrangement. So you had silk, tea, and cotton textiles coming from India into Europe. Um, the East India Company pretty much monopolized that trade, um, partly by the support and the sanction of the English government, right? So England more or less allowed them to stay a monopoly, and then also if any rivals did pop up, they would just buy them out. So generally, Europe very much wanted what Asia had to sell, right? All these silk, spices, tea. Um, Asia wasn't very much interested in what Europe had, except for all the silver that was coming from the Americas. So silver, right, would come from Americas into Europe, then it would flow the, to the east to India and China, and back would come. This was the sort of global trade network of the time. And the East India Company had a big slice of that trade. So what makes this sort of approach to colonization or colonial expansion modern is the East Indian Company did not particularly care to conquer anybody or rule anybody. That's a big hassle and it's expensive, right? To all of a sudden now have to be administrating whatever roads and hospitals and whatever that else that a government does. Um, East India Company wanted to stay lean and mean and just pull out profit. Right? So it would come in and just try to cooperate with the locals. Could hire locals in their operation. Also bring in English and Scottish agents who would move to India, live in India, and work for the India Company. There was a similar sort of situation, although different, uh, trading in different um, things, which was in Africa. So the Royal Africa Company, also a British company, there they were trading in. They had some agricultural plantations, but they were also trading in. If you've ever seen the film Out of Africa, uh, that period, right, where the British were established in Africa, and it's that movie traces a woman who she's actually a Dutch woman, I think, who goes and tries to make a living with cattle ranching, right, and decides instead to grow coffee and anyways, but yep, that's what people are doing, right, and of course taking human beings and capturing them and sending them into slavery. So pretty so the Virginia Company uh, was again a just a corporation that was formed in the United States. that set up a colony in what is now the United States, right, in Virginia. And these were the earliest English uh, colonies in North America. So the investors in the Virginia Company were a little bit more idealistic, maybe than the uh, right than the other corporations that we've seen. They really did sort of think that they were building a new society, a new commonwealth. They were trying to model it explicitly on the Roman Republic. Um, so each, company could have its own sort of ethos, right, and its own way of doing business. But it's a new and interesting way to approach empire. So I mean, England wasn't really so much building an empire in the traditional sense, but they were enabling companies to create what were effectively empires by establishing these extensive trade connections, bringing colonists to operate the outposts. Um, but those companies did very much depend on the English government, right? Because there were other empires out there with militaries, right? So Spain and Portugal weren't going to just sort of sit still and let British companies take over all the trade. So they did need the British military, right, to companies' interests. So looking at North America, so the first English colonies there were pretty small, right, very much ill-equipped to survive alone on a vast continent. So it's not like Cortez, right, coming in with a few hundred Spaniards and conquering the Aztecs or whatever. Um, Here we have, just a few handful of farmers um, trying to grow something, trying to figure out what they could grow. Eventually, it turned out it was tobacco, right? Um, but they needed the help of the Native Americans, and early on, at least, it was cooperation among them. They really, the English had no choice. They couldn't beat the Native Americans. They were barely hanging on and barely surviving. Um, but so it was discovered that tobacco was a cash crop, right? You could export that back to Europe and make good money, and it grew well in Virginia. And meanwhile, right, you have the Royal Africa Company bringing in slaves, right, to work the land, to work these tobacco fields, and before long, Virginia becomes a profitable and expanding colony. Uh, there was also a more sustained inflow of colonies. The Spanish colonies were like fairly small, kind of skeletal, right? But the British had more and more sort of people coming in, and so you had a different sort of colonization, um, more based on people trying to build new lives rather than people just coming in trying to pull silver out. And there was, for a while at least, cooperation with the natives. Um, Land was not technically sort of stolen or conquered; it was, quote, purchased, although it's it's unclear that the Native Americans had the same concept of ownership as the British did, right? So when they offered to buy something, it's not clear that the communication was right there. And even if it was maybe technically purchased, it effectively stolen, right? At any rate, the English got the better. The English also began to establish colonies in the Caribbean, right? Jamaica being one of those important colonies. Recall right at the beginning, the first slide, right? That map of like speckled colonies all over the globe. Well, that's how it's working with the English, right? India, Africa, North America, now in the Caribbean. Uh, so they bought Jamaica from the Spanish, the English, and this became an important center of sugar production, and they imported slaves from Africa to work uh, those sugar fields. So, so many, in fact, that eventually the slave people outnumbered Europeans about 3-1, right? And so this was a fairly tense situation for the Europeans, right? They had to revolt was a possibility at any moment. We'll see later in the lecture on the French Revolution that just such a revolt happened against the French in Haiti. So when when these colonies exist far away from the center of power, right, and you have an enslaved population that far outnumbers uh, the Europeans, that's a constant potential for rebellion. So as we see, right, the English Empire is expanding, but it's far flung, and they really needed an expanded military force and a great navy to have any hope of sort of controlling all these trade routes and all these colonies. So they needed a strong military, right? And they also needed strong banking institutions. Again, so all this trade needed to be financed, right? So if you wanted to raise money um, to to go capture a bunch of slaves and then go sell them in Jamaica and then go pick up a bunch of sugar and bring it back and maybe have it turned into rum, taken back to um, England or whatever. Um, you needed typically to take out a big loan from a bank, and you needed banking institutions along with a military to make sure that um, right your ship was not hijacked en route. So all this was, and England had to sort of secure all this. It was all fairly expensive, and so taxation rates were pretty high, right? To keep this whole system going, there was high taxes on all the trade. So, for example, the Navigation Acts of the mid 1600s um, prevented foreign ships from importing goods to Britain, right? They wanted the monopoly on all this trade, so they would have either high tariffs or total bans on foreign ships coming in trying to sell their goods. Um, and this gave them sort of an advantage, right? There were other, so the Dutch were kind of a similar approach. There was the Dutch East India Company as well, right? The Dutch were following a similar model, but they didn't have quite the same authoritarian approach to it, and this sort of gave the English an advantage. Right? They had a bit more control over their economy in this way. But as you can imagine, people don't tend to like high taxes, right? And this certainly rubbed many English colonists and traders the wrong way. And if you know anything about the history of the American Revolution, right, there's a picture of the Tea Party. Um, this is going to be a, a big point of contention, right? All of these taxes will in part spark the American Revolution. So, I mean, this is not new, right? And a problem for empires since the Romans. How do you manage and maintain a large territory? I mean, the British Empire, in terms of like just the breadth of it, is the largest we've seen yet, really, right? Ranging from India to North America. Um, so, how do you do that, right? If you've got too loose of a hand, right? If you kind of are more laid back, um, then it's very easy for right various areas to just decide to splinter off, right? And then you don't get your trade, you don't get your taxes. Um, Too strong of a hand will create rebellions, as did in the United States, right? Um, then there was a revolution in England, right? Um, where eventually what was once a sort of like strict monarchy became a sort of shared power arrangement between the king and the parliament. Um, during those during that era of revolution, it was advantageous for the colonists to sort of like say decide who they wanted to believe was in power and sort of follow them depending on whether it was to their financial interests, right? So they could say, oh well, yeah, we're not following the king's rules anymore. Now parliament's in charge, and so we're not going to pay this tax. And right? So um, we were kind of setting the stage for the next lecture, which is all about revolutions, right? We'll start with the French Revolution. Uh, I do want to take a moment to talk about the Native Americans, right? So all this in North America, all this colonization is largely at the expense of the Native Americans. We um, said, early on there was friendly relationships, right? Um, and maybe that was not the best move on the part of the Native Americans, right? You wonder if they had just simply slaughtered the early on, maybe they would have been done better off in the end. But they were friendly and they helped them, and in the end, that they were driven right further and further from their land. Um, Native Americans even served, right? They were recruited as allies, as various imperial powers fought each other, right? You would, the British were fighting the French, one on the other side might try to recruit some local tribe to fight on their side. But as soon as all that stuff shook out, and the colonists began to feel secure, and right, the British began to establish a firm foothold on North America. Sure enough, right, the Native Americans were the next target for further and further west until they had really no land left. So that is it for today. And next on Wednesday, we'll talk about revolutions.